This is Derrick Broze.
Derrick Broze.
This is Derrick Broze of the Conscious Resistance. I'm here in Standing Rock.
That man is wanted in 5 different countries: Chile, Argentina, Brazil.
We've been fighting a long time, and we've all lost so very much. So many loved ones gone.
Don't you fucking tease that horse!
You are not alone. There are pockets of resistance all around the planet. We are at the brink. Above all, stay alive. You have no idea how important you are. If you're listening to this, you are the resistance.
Derrick Broze, the Conscious Resistance Network, and 90.1 KPFT Houston. And I'm here with another update with Tareq Haddad, who we spoke with last week for a week 1 review of the Julian Assange extradition hearing going on in the UK. And today we'll be reviewing week 2, looking forward to week 3. So how are you doing today?
Yeah, good, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, we've just spent the last half hour talking before recording and covering lots of other information that I wish I was recording. But we're going to maybe we'll have another conversation another day. But today we're going to focus on just the Assange developments. Last week we detailed what took place there, and I have pulled up, you have 5 different updates that you yourself wrote throughout the week, and of course there's been some pretty interesting developments, and you were just telling me a moment ago that you think there's been some interesting shifts from week 1 going into week 2. What do you think are those biggest shifts that you saw so far?
Well, it's been interesting because I think the last few weeks and months I've kind of learned to, even if something is controversial, to kind of say it anyway, but and maybe that's got me into a little bit of trouble, but so I mean sometimes I dislike the tone of some people when it's kind of assumed that it's sort of a kangaroo court, and I completely understand that mentality and where that comes from, and there's an abundance of evidence to support that. But at the same time, kind of covering it as a journalist, I always want to feel that the judge in the case has her own volition, and she's, regardless of what people think of her, she's clearly a kind of a intelligent and she hasn't got to this position of being a sort of a senior district, she's a district judge in sort of British legal system. She's a fairly capable person, and because there is that sort of, I get this impression that, and I have seen her do this myself, where, she's brought out pre-written statements and the kind of, and I felt this myself, that you think, okay, this was a pre-judged decision. And there's been lots of rulings, obviously, that go in favor of the US government repeatedly. But, there's been, so many things that have happened in the past and that do happen repeatedly on that. But sort of, I feel like towards the kind of this week a little bit, we've had some, it's funny in these court hearings, they go on for sort of hours and hours, but sometimes it's what can happen in a sort of split second is what is the most interesting. But we had sort of, now in the second week we've had 3 exchanges between Assange and District Judge Barreza, and kind of how they were handled were kind of revealing and kind of is also telling about, Julian Assange himself in terms of, the last. So obviously I think there was a lot of media coverage when there was the sort of first, sort of, as the mainstream media put it, outburst. And so we saw lots of headlines about that, and, it was kind of Assange was told to be quiet in the courtroom or he might be thrown out. There was a second outburst where, again, he was, similar things were said, and obviously kind of the way that can sometimes get portrayed as, they're telling Assange to be quiet or to sort of shut up in the courtroom, and I understand that because he's obviously sitting in the glass dock in the back of the courtroom, but a lot of these things are actually kind of purely on the sort of like the procedure of the court system is kind of, once the witness is sworn in, it's not normal for any defendant to kind of speak to trying to speak to the witnesses or interfere with the lawyers' kind of prosecution and defense. So, and then we had the sort of, I think on the last day actually, where US prosecutors were trying to have the written statement of, I believe this was on the fourth day. They were trying to kind of make sure that the statement of Khalid al-Masri was not included in the bundle of evidence essentially that was going to be presented before the court. And I don't know if you kind of managed to read up on that or you're familiar with it from before, but actually, yeah, I don't know if it's worth is it worth going into that or? Yeah,
if you don't mind explaining it for those who aren't familiar.
Sure. So Khalid al-Masri was a Lebanese-German dual citizen, and he, I believe he was kind of on a holiday or kind of a tourist trip in around 2003 in Macedonia, sort of kind of Eastern Europe, and he was picked up by Macedonian police, sort of, I believe, beaten, drugged, and kind of one way or another he ended up in the hands of the CIA. In that kind of, they thought, probably due to his background that he was someone on terror watch list or something like that. So kind of he essentially kidnapped from middle of Europe, taken to sort of what is known as a sort of sandpit site in Afghanistan. He was left he was under CIA kind of interrogation techniques, kind of sort of what has been very widely reported, obviously, since many of these things have come out because of WikiLeaks. And so Khalid al-Masri's statement is kind of going off of what John Goetz said, kind of, who was one of the investigative journalists that gave testimony this week. And that's also kind of an interesting kind of, how that all relates to WikiLeaks. It's been a kind of a central part of this week where, so al-Masri, essentially what happened to him is 3 months while he was in Afghanistan, he'd been, I believe what happened to him was he kind of got, after he was kidnapped, he was beaten up by 13 men in sort of black uniforms, ski masks. Some of this is actually a little bit graphic. I don't know if I should sort of just give a disclaimer first. But he was kind of beaten up and sodomized before he was, while he was in Afghanistan, sort of given anesthetics sort of to get him on the plane, and he was obviously getting moved around from one place to the other, sort of in and out of consciousness, because he was he was a tourist. He's never been charged of any crime in all this time, because he was a tourist in Macedonia at the time. It was 3 months into his rendition in Afghanistan that they discovered that he had a German passport. So obviously this would be a diplomatic nightmare if, sort of, can you imagine the headline of, I mean, it's just, a German citizen essentially, and obviously, citizenship can mean a very substantial thing, obviously diplomatically. So it's obviously very embarrassing. So what happened was he was sort of in one of these planes, the same way that he was plucked from Eastern Europe. He was sort of dropped off in the middle of some random forest in Albania, with 15,000 euros, I believe, and just told to never speak about it again, which was kind of crazy. It's a crazy
really
story.
Disturbing story. I mean, like you said, it's a little graphic. I just want to make that clear that what al-Masri's story through Goetz's reporting showed, probably for the first time publicly, and proved to Americans what WikiLeaks and others had said, that there was these rendition, as they like to call them in the U.S., which is basically kidnapping. Yeah. They were taking people and, as you said, taking them to these black sites and abusing them physically, mentally, psychologically, and then dumping them elsewhere. And this case ended up becoming a cover story and sort of showed, brought to light that this was a reality. And and as you're saying, like, Goetz is basically saying in his testimony that it was through WikiLeaks that he was able to confirm the truth of this, correct?
Yes, absolutely. So what he kind of, and I wrote one of my pieces this week, it was kind of specifically kind of revolving around this point of Goetz's testimony. But when he got back to Germany and made contact with Goetz, no one believed this story. It just sounded so crazy in that sort of point in time in 2003, 2004. You have to remember that this is probably, 3 years immediately after 9/11. So, I guess in terms of the American psyche as well, I mean, it's very different times than what it is now, kind of the mood of the country. And so, yeah, it was completely unbelievable. But, in Germany, this reporter, managed to track down the 13 people, kind of using hotel logs and flight logs and kind of hotel reservations to sort of track these 13 men down to North Carolina. Kind of found out that there was CIA, and I think he's interviewed a few of them. I'm not sure if sort of any of those quotations, the sort of his reporting is in German, so I've not actually. I remember at the time I read sort of English translations of those pieces when they kind of around nearer the time, but some of the details are a bit foggy at the moment. But so what happened was very rarely and kind of a bold diplomatic move was made from Munich state prosecutors, and they actually decided to issue a arrest warrant against 13 CIA officials due to the reporting of Goetz. And this is all before he had actually met Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. So at this point, he's the investigations editor at Der Spiegel. So he's not any scrub. He's a serious investigative journalist that knows what he's doing. And he's invited to WikiLeaks and sort of the Guardian offices in London in 2010 to kind of take part in that sort of very early redaction process, which is very central to many of the US prosecution's claims that Assange endangered lives. So that's why, he spoke very strongly about what the redaction process was. And we had a lot of talk about that. And kind of, this week, I think why I say that there was a turning point actually is, and I believe kind of this was tweeted out by Kim.com recently, but I think he puts it very eloquently, is that this was supposed to be a trial about, or a hearing about Julian Assange, but it's really turning into sort of a hearing about US war crimes in one of the most iconic, courts in the Western world, the Old Bailey, so it's, everyone's sort of seen that very famous statue of Lady Justice. What I mean? So it's kind of, we're kind of in this sort of very central public court with actually a lot of media coverage. We talked a little bit, I believe, about this in the past, how the UK, there's been a lot of media coverage for Assange, and kind of this, the kind of end of the day sort of by lunchtime on Friday, we'd had, I think most of the world's media, again, is reporting on Assange, some good, some bad, but, a lot of it was good, and one of the jobs that I'm doing at the moment is sort of collating some of the different articles that are being written by the journalists at present, because there's like I mentioned to you sort of in the call that we were talking before, a lot can happen in just a single session of evidence. If you're taking sort of transcriptions, and you'll see some Twitter accounts that sort of transcribing most of the hearings, or people like Kevin Gostola, who's doing an amazing job reporting, and people like the Assange Defense Twitter account, who are sort of live tweeting much of the proceedings, things I couldn't personally sort of do, but I'm there kind of trying to take down the shorthand transcription of the quotes as much as I can, and sort of trying to build up as accurate of a record as I can for what I think is kind of the what the sort of my take on the most important bits are that are happening in the week. But the great thing is that sort of every journalist there is kind of picking up bits and pieces, and we're all kind of collectively, there is, it's becoming a trial about US war crimes, like I said, instead of being about Assange.
Well, it is really astounding, and even more astounding is, other than, like you said, the few kind of reporting on one of the biggest revelations of the week that we're going to get into in a moment, there really hasn't been much coverage, as we mentioned last week, in the American mainstream of the trial. If there's some sort of sexy soundbite or clip that they can grab, then it gets reported. But before we get into that, the bigger news of the week, I do want to just reiterate, because we mentioned John Goetz, the investigative reporter, a couple of times here, and we were just talking about his testimony that WikiLeaks helped him confirm cases of U.S. rendition, kidnapping and abuse and sodomy of what turned out to be a German citizen. And then, as you just said a moment ago, and I think this is important to kind of pause at for a moment, because here in America, one of the things that we've heard since back in the Obama administration, so going on over a decade now, is that WikiLeaks and the leaks released from them led to dead American soldiers, and it's led to people being harmed and put service members and informants at risk and these sort of things. And that is one of the key things, as you mentioned, that John Goetz went over and sort of destroyed that idea. Can you talk a little bit more about that for a moment?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, with this week, there's been numerous different witnesses that have spoken to this point, and it's all picking away at sort of little details of it, because I guess the nature of the U.S. prosecution is actually so egregiously wrong that every witness, because all the witnesses that we've had are defense witnesses, so every witness that we've had is kind of actually excellently sort of been correcting that record along the way. There's kind of exchanges between the sort of, or moments where you're kind of, it can be difficult to follow, or it's you're not sure how certain defense witnesses are going to kind of to handle the questioning, or if sometimes their expertise can be not, if the lawyer can make a sufficient case that that their evidence shouldn't be heard in the court, or it's not relevant to the case, it can essentially be deemed unworthy. But we've seen a lot of kind of interesting interactions between, Berates has had to make a few decisions, and some have gone in Assange's way, or, well, maybe not in his way, but some of them have, in terms of, even with Al-Masri, for example. I was trying to say that the US government was trying to have that witness statement taken out, and Assange actually, I think when I believe there was issues with sort of having him in the video conference. I was actually having a lot of technical difficulties myself, so I'm not sure if it was. I think it was just read out to the courtroom in the end, because we had so many different technical difficulties getting hold of him. But I believe there was some sort of interruption with his testimony. I'm sort of actually struggling to remember the facts, but Assange sort of addressed the court to say that you will not silence a victim of CIA rendition, even though he's been sort of on several occasions he's been just having to be quiet in the courtroom. But despite all of these very not tense, but they're very drawn out legal proceedings that can be very tiring, Assange has kind of shown at certain points that he is actually very alert to what's going on, and that he picked up on such a sort of for him to kind of pick up on that point was he's very alert, which is kind of incredible to see. In terms of the second time he had an interaction with Berates, it was about something that the prosecutor, James Lewis QC, had sort of said something wrong in the courtroom, and it was sort of, he was attributing a statement to WikiLeaks, and he just misread a word, but I actually didn't catch it. And that's the funny thing is that Assange was kind of so on the ball that he was like, no, that's not what we said. It was sort of input instead of, I forget what the correction was, but he is there, and I guess that's why he does want, and that application was made in the past to kind of sit with his lawyers, because he is really a central figure in a lot of what took place. And obviously kind of he's watching different people that he's known and worked with in various ways come and take the stand. And so when he saw that this CIA rendition victim had sort of not been treated properly by the court, he was adamant that that his statement be read.
I just want to say that's really powerful, I think, to hear, because the only thing that I know that has been kind of put out there is that how if anything, it's like he's losing his mind, or he's and people who I think genuinely care about him saying like he seems to maybe have been obviously the victim of psychological torture or something along those lines. But the only thing we've really heard up to this point is kind of that he's out of touch. He might not even be in control of all of his mental faculties, or just trying to smear his character. Whereas the picture you're painting here is a bit more the Assange I think people might remember from years ago, that is very astute and aware of what's going on around him. So that's a good point.
I'm under no he's under very difficult circumstances, I'm sure, because just even the journey of getting to the courtroom sounds like a very arduous and a very restrictive and dehumanizing process. But I think, when he's there, he is, he is fully sort of, he is with it. And I mean, I hate to speculate, but I just imagine that probably even sitting in the back of that courtroom is probably a welcome change than being sort of in a cell somewhere. And we have heard a lot of interesting evidence this week, and kind of going back to John Goetz, where we kind of had we had a better understanding of the cryptome incident in terms of the kind of unredacted files being released, and kind of how, obviously, I don't know how, I'm sure a lot of this would be known to you and your listeners, but the Guardian password and things like that. So, there is a constant flow of evidence. So it's, and he's as much involved as anyone else. It's his life at stake. And I think, I was actually just having this thought the other day, was that, if it would be so nice to see Julian Assange take the stand himself, actually, and kind of give witness in his own, give evidence in his own case, in his own defense. That would be quite nice to see, because in terms of a kind of a fair judicial process, that's kind of what I would expect.
Yeah, it's one that you would hope for, right? And I want us, as we start to kind of wrap up this week's looking at week 2 and then looking forward to week 3, I would just want to mention a couple points and then get your thoughts on them. These are all, of course, coming from his website, which I will link below for everybody to read. But we have first one of the witnesses, Eric Lewis, describing for the court what Julian Assange could expect if he is extradited to the U.S. as far as the conditions, which he described as harsh and inhumane, and where he also goes into specifically saying that he thinks that Assange would likely be placed in the special administrative measures, which is going to be highly, if not complete solitary confinement, something similar to what he's been dealing with. And so you have that discussion on sort of here's what he can expect, and then at the same time, he also expanded on what you described as the politicization of the U.S. Department of Justice, and particularly under Attorney General William Barr, who many people on our channel, of course, are familiar with this. He's a decades-old politician that going back to the Bush administration, the first Bush administration. And I just want to pause there for a moment, because Eric Lewis is talking about, look, this is what Assange is facing, and at the same time pointing to seeing how the Department of Justice is basically being used as a tool to go after not only Assange, but journalists in general under the Trump administration. And of course, when Trump was running, and his supporters, I think many of them were hopeful that Trump would, after celebrating WikiLeaks and how great WikiLeaks is, and now infamously turning a blind eye to Assange and acting like he doesn't know. What do you think that this shows here? Where, I mean, it is clear to me, I think, that this is, regardless of people's feelings about Trump, this is what the administration has been doing. This is what the Department of Justice under his leadership has been doing. And it doesn't seem like there's any, and I know we're kind of re-emphasizing what we said last week, but it bears repeating that it doesn't seem like there's any chance for Assange to get a fair trial at all if he comes to the United States.
Yeah, and we had very strong evidence further on that this week with Eric Lewis. He was a very, very qualified lawyer in the US, again working for Reprieve. So we had struggling on his name at the moment, the sort of founder of Reprieve, speaking last week, kind of famous UK lawyer, and kind of now we've had his sort of US equivalent, who's he's the chairman of US Reprieve. And it took sorry, I'm just lost my kind of thought process, but he took us through a lot of these different aspects of what Assange could expect if he is in the US, and this kind of his testimony was very wide ranging in terms of, well, he submitted 5 witness statements, which were quite long, which trying to read the evening before each day, and kind of turns out that when questioning and examination came, it was it was sort of used in completely different orders, and they were jumping back and forth between them all. But so there was a lot of evidence that he gave there, but he kind of spoke of pre-trial rendition and sentencing. So but essentially, yes, if the case goes completely in the US government's favor, from now until who knows when, Assange essentially could be spending the rest of his life in solitary confinement. And Lewis spoke of the sort of rapid deterioration that can cause in people's sort of, so many different things. There's been plenty of research about it, but it is essentially a form of psychological torture, and that's well established in the scientific literature.
One of the other things that I did want to reference, in addition to describing the conditions that Assange is facing, and of course, we've already gone over the fact that the U.S. still can't point to anybody who has been killed or harmed specifically because of WikiLeaks. We know that he's facing these horrible conditions. And then you were talking about the American attorney Eric Lewis, who of course is with Reprieve, and some of his testimony. And he actually, in the beginning of the week, or I think it was on Tuesday, he first pointed to the assertion that Donald Trump's administration, he was talking about the politicization, but he was also saying that the Trump administration had a direct interest in Assange's persecution. And then later on in the week, we get the reporting from Jennifer Robinson, who specifically saying, who is of course Assange's attorney, saying that a 2017 meeting happened between U.S. Republican Congressman Dana Rohrabacher and Assange, where the Trump administration was apparently offering some help to them if they could provide the source of the 2016 Democratic emails, which some people have said is Russia, some people say it's Seth Rich. Talk a little bit about that and how important that is.
Yeah, I mean, this is, I think, a huge aspect of the story, because, and there's, internal debates that kind of run about this, but yeah, we had obviously Eric Lewis kind of giving us some sort of kind of laying out the background for people in terms of the chain of events that, because sort of this meeting with Dana Rohrabacher has been known about for a little bit of time. I think it was reported early on by, maybe the Washington Examiner or something like that. And it wasn't, to be honest, I don't think it was even a big secret that Rohrabacher was visiting Assange in the embassy. It was sort of at a time when Assange was frequently getting different visitors in the embassy, and it was sort of before his access to him became a bit more restrictive. And obviously, if you're a US congressman, you've got some sort of political kind of things to help you there to kind of get access if you need to. But as a result of that, we kind of have this big sort of debate about, and it sort of very much depends what spectrum of the news media you follow, because I know that sort of obviously like in sort of mainstream or left-wing media, it's kind of, Seth Rich is kind of this tainted name that you can't discuss, but whereas it was very much discussed on the right, actually, and it's interesting because I was kind of considered myself a liberal sort of reporter working at the International Business Times, and I remember actually I wrote a little bit about Seth Rich and some of what happened with Fox News, and that's kind of being that's kind of subject to some legal scrutiny right now in the US in terms of some civil suits. I believe we kind of actually in the last, maybe a couple of weeks before these hearings started, we had a request from, I believe, the Southern District of New York to the British High Court to request that Assange give testimony or evidence, at least, in the lawsuit that is between Fox News and Seth Rich's family. And so it's very central, this question of whether Seth Rich was the source to WikiLeaks documents is kind of, it's making its way through the courts slowly, but to people that are familiar with WikiLeaks or the organization, I think it's one of those areas that needs to be discussed a little bit more openly. I understand that Assange has historically been not wanting to name his sources, but in this instance, and this is kind of a belief that I've held for a long time, is that yes, he was your source, or I understand the idea of protecting sources, but if a source is dead and he's been dead, a good few years now, it's more of a criminal matter, and I understand, but I kind of why WikiLeaks might not want to ever kind of say that this was our source. But for me, as a kind of, because I have no sort of direct relationship to WikiLeaks other than sort of how they've helped my work, but in terms of, if I'm looking at this in terms of as a historian or as a journalist, I would be very interested, and I've personally had it confirmed to me from close friends of Julian that it was Seth Rich, and I've written about that previously, and I guess that's I've written several stories about that, and I think it's one of those areas that I think I'll want to keep probing, because even you could see in that statement of Jennifer Robinson, it doesn't use the name Seth Rich, and because it's a controversial thing to say, because it's not a widely accepted thing, and maybe it has its own legal repercussions. But I'm aware that the Seth Rich name, there's a lot of complexity to it that some of the people didn't want to accept, but it's definitely an essential part of this story, because it's the worst kept secret, really, in terms of it. Probably everyone that's followed WikiLeaks knows that Seth Rich was the source, but it's one of those things that it's worth the attention of people that are not really following the WikiLeaks thing. My strong suspicion is that the case of Seth Rich will be kind of the opening the sort of the Pandora's box that kind of reveals, it will reveal the horrors, but it will kind of reveal the truth as well, because there's a lot of reports that I mean, let's just kind of take my position when I was working for IB Times. We were sort of past the point that he was shot in the back in Washington, D.C. Anything reporting past that is now considered conspiracy theory. That to suggest anything other than it was a botched robbery was, lunacy, essentially. But there is plenty of contrary to the evidence, such as, the very infamous and slightly unethical Seymour Hersh tapes that came out, where someone had recorded Mr. Hersh speaking without his knowledge, but Mr. Hersh was speaking in good faith, and he's obviously a very honest, sort of straight-talking Chicago person, and sort of gave his 2 cents on what he thought what happened with Seth Rich, and he disclosed some information, obviously, because he wasn't aware he was being recorded, but he discussed some things that had come to him from certain sources about what had gone on. I believe, if I remember correctly, there is evidence that suggests that even though Seth Rich was reportedly shot in the back, he arrived alive in whatever hospital he arrived in, and he had sort of cuts on his hands as if he'd been slashed with a knife. So it's there was some sort of struggle that took place before the shooting happened, and there's other numerous inconsistencies with the sort of main account of what we've been told and the actual instances in the case, and obviously there are the evidence has never really been truly kind of found for what is a very crucial case. Regardless of left or right or whatever your politics, I think kind of his family deserved justice for what happened. Unfortunately, justice is a little bit of a slow process sometimes. But as we see with Assange, I think it can slowly turn. And I think in terms of just as it always has been, the support behind Assange is always great, because I think no one can deny the benefit of what he contributed to the world, essentially. Someone that helped expose numerous things, and it was also very nice to see the testimony of Nikki Hager, who's a New Zealand journalist, and was, he's written several books, and I don't know if that name is familiar to you, Derek, but he sort of exposed the early echelon network, which is the sort of precursor to the kind of this state apparatus that we have now in terms of NSA, everything like that, and he sort of gave testimony that got a lot of coverage, which sort of said that as a investigative journalist, I don't like the kind of reputation and the media coverage that Assange has received, because that's not the person that I knew. That's not the person that he met in 2010. He said the person that he met in 2010 was this very thoughtful and sort of almost philosophical person who was deeply concerned about human rights and seeing justice to people that have been adversely affected by essentially illegal wars and their disastrous consequences on lives, and that was sort of echoed over and over and over again with different people that gave evidence. We had a statement from Dean Yates, who is the bureau chief in Baghdad for Reuters, obviously talking about the famous collateral murder video. We had I forget his first name, Professor Sloboda, I believe, from Iraq Body Count, talking about how without WikiLeaks, a kind of 15,000 deaths in Iraq, civilian deaths, would not be known. So obviously, Iraq Body Count is sort of the world's authority on documenting civilian casualties in Iraq, and he spoke very highly of how Assange had been very very concerned about kind of protecting names, and it was very contrary to the very allegations that the prosecution put to Assange. So we had a lot of evidence to kind of clear the record this week, which was nice. So that's and we've got some other big names coming, I believe, next week.
Yeah, talk about that for a little moment. Well, first of all, thank you for that really powerful, important information. I know that Seth Rich, the finding out the truth of Seth Rich is still extremely important to many, many people, like you said, regardless of their political affiliation. I think journalistically, it's a story that clearly there's more to it than we've been told. So thank you for providing some info on that. But what are we looking forward to now coming in the third week as far as witnesses and just, I know you said before that this is supposed to go 3 weeks, might go 4 weeks. What is your feeling on that now?
I think it's a little bit up in the air. I've been reporting virtually for the last 2 weeks. I think I'm going to try and actually be a little bit more present in the courtroom this coming week, just to see if I can. It's going to be a little bit difficult because, as I've told you privately, I've had some laptop issues and things like that. But it's I get the sense that because they've reduced the number of witnesses, essentially. So one of the days we had sort of an early lunch break where the lawyers because we were running significantly behind schedule, essentially. At one point, we heard that there was 39 witnesses, and I believe I told you after the first week that we had a total of 18. But at sort of some point in the second week, I heard that there was a total of 39. But so what happened is, kind of the lawyers took about an hour and a half with Julian to decide which statements were going to be read instead of having them, because with every witness you have to kind of swear them in. The defense lawyers will introduce them to the court for about 30 minutes, taking the court through their witness statement, and then cross-examination, and the prosecutors can sort of allocate however long they need depending on their line of questioning. So for Eric Lewis, for example, we had a full day of cross-examination, or at least 4 hours of it. So that was quite intense. And we also had Mr. Schenkman, who is a constitutional lawyer and kind of a scholar on Espionage Act, who's been writing this sort of big compendium and history and analysis of the Espionage Act. So and so going forward, I just realised I'm kind of talking about actually people that were, we have so many things that these were all last week, but going forward, I believe we still have possibly Patrick Coburn, who's a very esteemed journalist here from the UK, who's obviously written a lot about Iraq. I'm not sure what's happening with Noam Chomsky. And can you imagine? I think we talked for about 45 minutes, and we didn't even mention that Daniel Ellsberg talked about the Pentagon Papers as well, and that was very significant for the week's hearings. We've also next week we've got, I believe, a fairly substantial another German reporter that's coming, and they're going to be talking about. I believe they're coming from Der Freitag. So Der Freitag was actually the publication that published the password hash that came from David Lee and Luke Harding's book, and that kind of led to some of the cables being out there without redactions. And I, depending on how that evidence goes, it could go. It could be another critical piece to the puzzle. Obviously, we've heard a little bit that Julian was, adamantly trying to get Der Freitag not to publish this password in the past. As soon as he found out that, that this book has kind of come out, so to have someone, but we've only sort of heard this as hearsay, kind of, or it was one of the lawyers that sort of said it in the court. But you know, to have someone that's actually from the newspaper, I think, you know, will have an editorial position to say, yes, Assange called us to say, you know, please don't publish, or something along that lines. Like, those could be sort of further evidence of how Assange was being extremely careful to protect people, and that this US prosecution is not as accurate as was put to the court, and that's the case being argued, that one of the primary cases being argued by the defense team is that actually the nature of this whole prosecution is misleading the court. And we've seen that again and again this week in terms of every single cross-examination by the prosecution has been, you know, despite how many other witnesses have sort of put the point to bed, you know, the prosecution lawyers keep repeating the falsehoods to every single witness. And an interesting example of this is actually going back to John Goetz. He was present in one of these meetings that was very substantial. I believe something again that relates to David Lee's books, but he in this Luke Harding and David Lee book, they kind of talk about this cavalier attitude that Assange allegedly had, according, you know, to informants. And there was some sort of kind of, it's what's become a fairly famous or contentious meeting in London, I believe, somewhere. But those, you know, Assange allegedly said some things that were very disparaging of informants. But John Goetz has kind of testified previously that Assange did not say that, and there's a lot of, you know, inaccuracies. And we had actually Nikki Hager kind of telling us that, personally, if I was writing a book, I wouldn't trust someone like David Lee as a witness in court, or as someone to give evidence, because he knew that he had personal animosity with Assange, and that was kind of why there was essentially that harmful book.
Yeah, and it's just, there's so much to this case. I feel like like you said, we took 30 minutes to mention Daniel Ellsberg, and
Yeah.
that is a very key point. So I'm glad that you remembered to bring that up. And I really hope that everybody who is hearing this, I think we've been talking for about 40 minutes about this case, just about week 2. Go back and review our week 1 conversation if you haven't yet. But really listen to this conversation, because I think you touched on so many important points. As I mentioned, the Seth Rich stuff,
Yeah.
Daniel Ellsberg's
I'm so
role.
sorry, there's so much going on.
No, it's important stuff, and this is the thing. Also, I want to reiterate as we wrap up that you did mention the Assange defense team. You also mentioned Kevin from Shadowproof. These are some other outlets that are doing great work right now, keeping people up to date with everything that's going on, that I definitely want to recommend in addition to your website. Is there anybody else you would recommend that people check out for deeper coverage?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I mean, Mohammed Almazi, obviously, former lawyer, works for Sputnik right now. You know, can expect good reporting from him on a daily basis. Courage Foundation, Assange Defense. I believe Juan Pastorelli has also been doing a really great job of reporting and doing video into sort of interviews and statements outside of court. And also Assange, well, actually, the whole Bridges for Media Freedom campaign. I know that sort of Naomi Colvin does a lot of work to kind of help journalists behind the scene, kind of getting witness statements and sort of getting everything to them. On kind of, it's essentially she's doing a lot of the hard work to help journalists out in the background. But you know, things like that. But there's a lot of indie media helping each other out, which is really nice to see, actually. And we actually had this incident this week where Kevin Gustola was locked out of the video conference for an hour or so, but we had sort of everyone kind of complaining, and I mean, myself and one other person almost got kicked out because we were trying to get him back in the proceedings, but caused a bit of a fuss with some of the staff. But you know, there's sort of this camaraderie that's going on in terms of everyone helping each other out.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a beautiful part of the independent alternative media in general, is that there's so much support for each other's work. Of course, there's a healthy competition of who can cover the most important and valuable stories. But in the end, I think that's beneficial for truth overall. And
Yeah.
it's good to see people supporting. So I wanted to make sure to make note of that. I will send everybody to your website to check out all of the latest updates and to look forward to your week 3 coverage. And maybe we'll be seeing Noam Chomsky this week. Maybe the following week,
Yeah.
should be interesting nonetheless. Any final thoughts you'd like to add before we end the call?
No, that's it, man. So much going on. I feel like I kind of sort of spewed and rambled lots of different things. Kind of haven't had really much of a chance to think about most of this myself. But I think we'll just kind of do the best we can covering this and just see where it goes, obviously.
Well, thank you for the efforts that you made, man. I really do appreciate it, and we will continue. Yeah. And if you're down for it next weekend, I would love to have, if you're available, let's continue these conversations and direct people towards your reporting through, every week.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Appreciate the chance to talk to you. It's been good.
Okay. All right, everyone. Until next time, please do find his work at tareqhaddad.com. I'll link everything below, including all the articles that we went over. And until next time, remember, you are powerful, you are beautiful, and